Well, the science of planetary boundaries, which defines a safe operating space for humanity in the Anthropocene, has an opportunity to be picked up by both policy, society, and business for the three following reasons. The first one is that we're starting to see more and more empirical evidence that we are starting to hit the ceiling of what the planet can cope with. So we're starting to see real impacts on the economy today, which is understood increasingly by society. The second issue, which is interesting, is that we're starting to move towards a much stronger focus on the benefits of action rather than the big costs of protecting the environment. So we're starting to understand that the biosphere, that the environment at large, from fresh water to biodiversity, is actually the basis for our economy. And that good business, good development, good welfare originates from a very wise stewardship of the biosphere. And the third reason is more, we're living in an era where everyone understands that we are in the globalized phase of the economy, the globalized phase of communication, and increasingly we're starting to understand that we are also in the globalized phase of environmental implications. That the whole notion of the Anthropocene is sinking in. And once you're in a globalized phase of the environment, you're starting to see nations in the world not accepting any longer that one part of the world is ruining or undermining the environment with impacts on another part of the world. So I think we're starting to see a much stronger, let's say, a much stronger articulated debate on the necessity for global partnerships, what we call planetary stewardship. But of course we're not there yet, but there is at least a trend towards this direction. And one example is the United Nations work on going from the Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, where there is a genuine discussion on setting global sustainability criteria, including fresh water, within which you can have growth and prosperity. This is a totally new discourse compared to the old discourse, which has been growth and development, and let's reduce environmental impacts as far as we can. Well, the local global interactions are today, let's say, at the heart of necessary focus and solutions. So up until recently, we have been mostly preoccupied by investing in local improvements of freshwater use, of agricultural productivity, energy supply, etc. And we haven't had to really consider the fact that the global scale is now impacting on the local scale. We've now come to a point where global drivers of change, climate change affecting freshwater supply, affects the local scale. So now suddenly global sustainability is a prerequisite even for a farmer's livelihood in Burkina Faso or the economic development in a country anywhere in Europe. So the global hits the local. But of course the trick is that it's success at the local that needs to add up to meeting criteria at the global. So, we now have come to a point where we need to have innovations at the local scale, scaling up and aggregating to positive change at the global scale. Now, we don't have any good examples of that so far. This is the dilemma we're facing, that you have windmill parks in certain parts of Europe, you have sustainable agriculture in other parts of Latin America, for example, but we're not seeing these things adding up to a positive change. So despite success on islands, the curves are still moving in the wrong direction at the global scale. So this is where my conclusion is, at least, that we need much more global leadership. We need to have a political leadership that regulates the playing field by putting a carbon tax in place, a clear restriction on how we expand agriculture in the world, a clear restriction on how we use fresh water, not as a way of putting a halt to development, but in order to create, a space for growth and development. So it's this magic of linking local innovation and growth with policy and support, which can guide a transition to a more safe and desired future. And this is often portrayed as utopian, but I often try then to remind everyone that, well, but we do it already in global trade. We have the World Trade Organization. We do it already in health. When the H7N9 virus kills 25 people in Shanghai, it becomes a global regulation immediately. So we have mechanisms to work together as a global community when we have risks which we cannot accept. But for some reason, when it comes to the environment, it is always portrayed as being more or less impossible to solve at the global scale. But we're doing it elsewhere all the time. We do it on the financial sector all the time. I mean, the financial transactions are in fact global today, and they're regulated globally. So there's an interesting opportunity, I think, to learn from other sectors in terms of now joining forces of how to get to local improvements through global collaboration. We concluded that freshwater use is one of the 9 planetary boundaries. Why is it one of the planetary boundaries? Well, it's because freshwater is, to put it simple, the bloodstream of the biosphere. It's the factor that determines the resilience of the entire terrestrial ecosystem. It's behind all biomass growth, it's behind all biodiversity, it's behind all agriculture in the world, and therefore it is the regulating factor behind carbon sinks, nitrogen flows, phosphorus flows. So it's the very mechanism behind the scenes, under the hood of the Earth system machinery, to regulate the stability of the Earth system. So we concluded that you can empty your rivers in the world to a certain point, beyond which you may start seeing threshold effects in terms of that regulatory capacity. We concluded that the boundary for that is in the order of 4,000 cubic kilometers per year of maximum consumptive use. We are today using some almost 3,000 cubic kilometers, so we're withdrawing much more, in the order of 6,000, but we're only consuming 3 because some of it flows through agricultural systems, etc. So we have some degrees of freedom at the global scale, but we're rapidly moving towards a ceiling because we know that just to feed a world of 9 billion people will exceed the boundary. So it's an interesting time right now that it's not as if we've pushed water so far that we are in a global crisis, but we're certainly heading in the wrong direction, and we have hotspot regions in the world where things are already in the red, so to say. So the solution must be to be much more clever in terms of productive water use, basically to produce more human well-being per drop of water. There's an enormous untapped potential in using rainfall much smarter, because remember that in the end it's only 10-20% of the rainfall which becomes runoff. 80% infiltrates in the soil and becomes green water, which evaporates back to the atmosphere. And this enormous amount of water can be used much more cleverly. We can manage our landscapes in ways that maintains particularly diversity of ecosystems, which are not there just for the sake of preserving species, but for the sake of having much better flow of water through landscapes, and therefore a much more stable supply and a much more resilient supply. So you can avoid shock waves of floods, for example, when we have straightened out rivers too much, but instead having meandering systems. So it's a question of getting a much more clever integrated stewardship for productive water use and for securing rainfall in the future. Then, of course, we need to collaborate again as nations in the world. You'll have regions in the world that grow so fast and have so little water that their only solution for the future will be through virtual water trade. It will be through collaborative trading of fresh water via food produced in other parts of the world. So again, we need democracy and stability in the world to operate in order to share the finite fresh waters we have. But to conclude, basically say we're in a dire situation. The growth of demand of fresh water is tremendous. I mean, it's growing exponentially, will continue to grow exponentially as the world becomes richer and more populous. But still, the conclusion is we can solve it. It's interesting that we have so much technology and so many management practices and so much untapped potential that there's no scientific evidence that would suggest that we cannot sustainably feed a world population of 9 billion people, for example. And I'm emphasizing food because 90% of your and my freshwater need is for food, after all. So this is the bulk of the fresh water we're using, 3,000-4,000 liters per person per day, is for our diet. So this is a challenge, but also an area where we can move quite successfully into the future.